My name is Dan Scott. I'm the director of the Mansfield program in Ethics and Public Affairs. And this event is a cooperative with the Wildlife Biology Department. And that's good because we have an ethicist and a biologist here, and they're going to give you a fantastic talk. And I'm going to let Mark Doublewhite introduce himself.
Sure. So my name is Mark Doublewhite. I'm an associate professor in the Wildlife Biology program, and it's my pleasure to introduce John Vucinich from. I always have to remember there's so many universities over there. Michigan Technical University in Houghton, Michigan, up in UP, and Michael Nelson, who's from Michigan State University, right? Yeah. See, and all these little states up there. And I think that it's one of my. It's a real pleasure for me to have these guys here. They're here. They're giving people may have seen this poster around. We're hosting them to give a conservation ethics workshop that'll sort of really expand on what the kind of things they talk about today in their public lecture here. And to me, I think it's a really it's an amazing thing you'll see the sort of the truly interdisciplinary nature of their work. And so a lot of people in universities, and it's kind of a buzzword, talk about being interdisciplinary. So in my work, I work with a geneticist. That's not interdisciplinary. And so I think what you'll see tonight is the true nature of interdisciplinarity, and it really reminds me of one of my favorite books that is, the title of the book is called A Monk and a Philosopher. And has anybody ever heard of this book? It's by a world-famous scientist who turns out to also be a fully ordained Tibetan Buddhist monk who is the scientific advisor to His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and a French-born or Vietnamese-born French-trained astrophysicist about the nature of reality and about simple things like what is science. And so through those kinds of productive discussions that this monk and the philosopher have had about things like science, it's really been a cornerstone to me to start thinking about what it is we do on a day-to-day basis. And I started off much like John, studying wolves in lots of different places. And yet I think it's not so much the actual scientific things we learn about wolves that really matter to humans as social and cultural beings, but it's the things they teach us or try to teach us. And I think that's kind of what John and Mike are going to talk about tonight. And so it's my pleasure to know them in some ways and to be able to introduce them tonight. So John and Mike, take it away.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah. I think we're more like the philosopher and the monkey, not the monk. So we're gonna spend a little time doing a lot of different things, and of course we're going to talk about the science from the Isle Royale Wolf Moose project. But the science isn't going to exist all by itself. We're really interested in what the science means, or what it might mean. What are the implications that the science might have for environmental ethics? And another way to think about that is, what are the implications that the science from the Isle Royale Wolf Moose project might have for how it is that we live in the world? And we don't typically think of this. We think of, well, science gives us facts about the world, and how we typically live in the world, I don't know, that's just a big, silly mystery. And we don't know how those things relate, and sometimes we even think they're not supposed to relate in any way. And so we're going to intentionally put them together at a number of points along the way. So I'm a philosopher by training, so I'm going to be in areas in science that aren't my training. And the first thing is that we don't have funders in philosophy, but evidently in the science they do. People give them money to do stuff. And so, of course, you have to thank your funders, the National Science Foundation, the National Park Service, and more and more, I think, from private donors who sponsor the project. Has anybody been to Isle Royale ever before? Wow, nice, that's cool. So this is a boring slide for you, but this is where Isle Royale is, in case you're not familiar. It's right in the upper sort of Great Lakes. about 15 miles from the Minnesota-Canadian border. It's a 210 square mile island, the largest island and the largest freshwater lake in the world. Basically, the Isle Royale Wolf Moose Project, or the Isle Royale itself, is populated by, it has kind of a unique population of animals, simple population of animals. It's populated by moose, who arrived at the island in about 1900, and wolves that arrived about 50 years later, about 1949. And this is a unique place. This is basically a single predator and a single prey system, and a system that's unexploited by human beings. These are kind of rare places in the world. The purpose of the study in some ways is really straightforward, really simple. The purpose is really just to explain how and why wolf and moose populations fluctuate. That's it. But that's about as simple as it starts, and then it gets much more complicated after that. The populations of wolves and moose have been studied for 53 years from a single observation plane with this incredibly handsome, studly pilot from Alaska. He's looking incredibly kind of rock starish in this picture, actually.
It's all the camera angle.
It's the camera angle, yeah. That's an upcoming album cover, I think, for somebody. So mostly the populations are studied in the winter. You can see them in the winter. So there's an 8-week winter field season where essentially you're counting wolves and moose. The purpose of the study is really just to understand the predator-prey dynamics over a long period of time. But to understand the predator-prey dynamics, you have to compare field observation to some theory. I'm told these are equations. And at this point, I'm done for the moment, and John takes over.
So we make these observations year after year, and the basic observations that we make are so simple. They're just how many wolves do we see each year, how many moose do we see each year, and especially importantly, how often or how frequently do the wolves kill the moose. And in science, when you make observations, you can't just say, oh, I made the observations and I'm done. You can't make sense of it all unless you compare it to some theory, and one of the most basic theories that we deal with is represented by these equations, Latko-Volterra predator-prey equations. And what I want to do is, in just one slide here, is I want to kind of give you the modus operandi for how science usually works, and then we want to kind of think about, well, maybe science could be done a little bit differently, but in order to understand how you might do it differently, I have to show you how we do it typically. And so the basic idea is that those two equations, one of the things that they say is that they say that kill rate, how often it is that wolves kill moose, is a really important part of figuring out how predator and prey interact and all that sort of thing. And there are two things that we become interested in. What are the causes of fluctuations in kill rate? Because kill rate's not the same all the time. Some years it's higher and some years it's lower. And well, what causes that? And another question to ask is, well, what are the consequences of those fluctuating kill rates? And there's a couple of basic ideas. What do we do here? One is that there might be some relationship between the ratio of moose to wolves, and that might have something to do with the kill rate. And another idea is that the kill rate, I'll show you the data in just a minute, is that the kill rate, one of the consequences that it may have is what it does to the wolf population, because that kill rate basically is a food supply for the wolves. And so anyways, this represents 40 years worth of data. While the project has gone on for 5 decades, this kill rate data has only been measured for a little over 40 years. And okay, well, we collect data like this, we make graphs like this, and we calculate R-squared values to tell us how well the line fits the data. And we could go on for days and days and days about the kind of things that we've learned about wolves and moose in this style and in this fashion. We know lots of other factors are involved in kill rates, weather and age structure and stuff like that. And so anyways, when I give talks at scientific meetings and usually at universities, I usually go on like this and talk about this sort of thing. But I also give a lot of evening programs to general audiences, and the story that I tell them is different. And after a while, I became to feel ashamed of the fact that I was telling what seemed to be two different stories to two different audiences, and I thought I need to stop that. And so, so now what I want to do is I want to tell you the story that I tell the rest of the people. And and one of the things that's so important is how long the study has gone on for, and we'll illustrate that through a series of slides going from when the project started, 1959, all the way to the beginning. And wolves will be over here on the left in red, moose over there in black on the right-hand side. This is the first 5 years of what had been observed after watching the wolves and the moose. And I'm showing you the first 5 years because most studies in ecology don't even last that long. Just a 3-year study takes a bit of endurance and effort and that sort of a thing. And so, well, what does a scientist do after watching something for 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years? Well, they draw conclusions. You know, the people that started this project, Durward Allen in particular, Dave Meach, after watching for 5 years, they drew some conclusions. And the conclusion that they drew is represented here in this quote. Our studies thus far indicate that the moose and wolf populations on Isle Royale have struck a reasonably good balance. And they're making reference to this notion of a balance of nature. And this is, of course, a conclusion being made and voiced in the early 1960s when that was a particularly popular idea. And, okay, well, that was fine. Now, Durward Allen, the fellow who started the project, he's a real pioneer in the field of wildlife biology, largely because he had this really simple idea, which is that we should keep watching because if something different happens, we won't know unless we keep watching. That was it. And so, but his colleagues at the time were like, Durward, you've had such a great career. You've done so many wonderful things. We want to see what you might do next. Durward, there's nothing happening. It's the same stuff year after year. And again, Durward was just like, nah, I think we should keep watching. And we're going to zing through 50 years in a relatively short period of time here. And in fact, we're going to make a big jump all the way up to the year 1980. And so by the time that 1980 comes along, and there's some important points along the way, the project was only designed to be a 10-year study, and the Park Service encouraged that it end at about that time. Durward Allen just ignored that advice and said, we're going to keep on watching. But what's happened by now is that the moose population has tripled in size and then gone down to about half its maximum size, and the wolf population has just about gone through the ceiling. And so if you thought there was a balance of nature before, you either have to say, I don't think that's what's going on anymore, or you have to change what you mean by the words balance of nature. And anyways, what happened next is that the wolf population declined really dramatically. What happened inadvertently, and wasn't even known immediately what had gone on, is that the canine parvovirus was introduced into Isle Royale. It was a newly evolved disease at the time. It evolved from a cat disease. Was brought to Isle Royale when a dog made it to Isle Royale. Dogs are not allowed to come to Isle Royale for that exact reason, but it's a difficult rule to enforce. And what's really important about this event, about this disease, is that Isle Royale is also a federally designated wilderness, and these are the places in our country where we are most proud about the fact that human impact is at its very least. And the thing about this disease is that it ends up being the single most important event in the entire history of wolves and moose on Isle Royale, and of course people caused it to happen. Now, the one thing that's important to appreciate is that it's now, many years later, that we know that that's what's going on. At the time when the wolves crashed, it wasn't clear what was going on. All that we knew is that there were 50 wolves, and a couple years later, only 14. And there was great concern that the moose population, or that the wolf population, would just plain old go extinct. Now, the other thing that, of course, people were wondering is, of course, what will happen to the moose population now that the wolves have declined by a great deal. Anyways, what happens next is that the wolf population makes this kind of short-lived recovery, and then they bottom out at even lower numbers. They're in the low teens for the better part of a decade, and all of that time, while the wolves are low, the moose just keep going higher and higher and higher. In 1996, there were 2,500 moose on Isle Royale, or nearly that many. It's one of the highest densities of moose recorded anywhere in the world. And before, in the early parts of the study, people were kind of like, are you sure you want to keep watching? And what good can come from that? And now people instead, they tend to have these questions, and the questions are only come from, you know, being able to keep watching and see what's going on. And one of the questions in the 90s that was kind of important, especially with the wolves, is why are they so low? They should seem to have as much food as they could ever want, with moose being so high. It's at this time that we begin to wonder, but it's just speculation that, well, maybe there's some inbreeding depression problems going on, and but there's, you know, there's no way to test it, and that's all that we can kind of say is just that. What happens next is the winter of 1996, and the winter of 1996 was dramatic for a couple of reasons. In this part of the world, it was the most severe winter on record, so for well over 100 years, the most severe winter. There was also a severe outbreak of ticks. These are ticks that bother moose. I'll tell you a little bit more about the ticks in a little bit. And then in addition to this, because the moose had been so high, they'd really done a number on their food supply. And so in just 1 year's time, the moose population went from about 2,500 to about 700 or so. And then now it looks like the wolves are trying to make some kind of a recovery or rebound here. And of course, this would seem to be pretty poor timing because there's hardly any moose left. And so then, well, then what happened? Well, actually, this is a kind of an important point. Rolf Peterson, who's been working on the project for about 4 decades now, and I've been working on the project for 2 decades now. We're both trained as animal biologists, and it's not until the mid-90s, really, the late 90s, that we permanently expand the scope of the study to also include investigations of the forest, in particular the herbivory relationships between moose and the forest. And think about it a little bit. Okay, wolves eat moose, and moose die because wolves eat them, and that's very interesting, and that keeps us interested for all these decades. It's not a big mental leap to say, well, if that's interesting, and if you're trying to figure that out, and then, oh, okay, moose eat the forest, I bet that's interesting too, and I bet you can't figure all the stuff out about the moose unless you're looking at the forest. Those aren't huge leaps, right? How long did it take us to do that? 37 years. And it's not because it's not us because we didn't know that it would be important. This is one of the testaments, one of the values of long-term research, is that it takes time to be able to expand the scope of the study to include the things that you know are important. Some of it is just methodological. It just takes different skill sets and different human resources to be able to put your minds to this sort of thing, and it takes time to put that all together. And also for all these decades, of course, you know, data and information is rolling in, and you're just kind of overwhelmed with just interpreting that sort of a thing. And so that's one of the key things about long-term research, and one of its great values. Anyways, as time rolls on a little bit, one thing is as we get closer to the present day, it does get more difficult for us to kind of understand exactly what's going on. It's almost as though it takes time for it to pass, and when it becomes more distant, then it feels like we sometimes have better explanations. And so anyways, what's happening next is the moose population begins to increase. Wolves are kind of bouncing around, but quite a bit. In any event, the real insights that come from this period of time have to do with analyses that we had conducted, and they were analyses that kind of spoke to that whole time period. We did a time series analysis that illustrates, or that's the results of which are illustrated here. The question is basically this: what causes the moose population to go up and down? And we said, well, let's think of it as maybe one of 3 possibilities. Is it fluctuations in wolf predation that causes the moose population to go up and down, or fluctuations in food abundance, or is it fluctuations in climate? Which of those 3, or a combination of things? And anyways, these arrows and these percentages give us a sense of that. And it was very interesting, of course, because in some important ways we think Isle Royale is a good example of strong top-down phenomenon, and I think that's true. This particular analysis doesn't necessarily show that, though. And so, but anyway, so wolves don't seem to have so much effect. Climate's very, very strong. Okay, well, when we did that study, a good friend of ours, Chris Wilmers, University of California, Santa Cruz, he called us up almost immediately, and he said, John, I think you did your analysis wrong. And I said, Chris, I wish you had told me that before we published it. And I said, can you tell me what you think we got wrong? And he says, well, you've always been saying that life was so different before and after 1980. You were saying that, yes, the wolves eventually recovered, but you were saying, you know, the ecology, the ecological relationships never really went quite back to what they had been. And so what he said is, why don't you do that same analysis that you'd done with that regression and those arrows and those percentages, but divide the time series into 2 parts and ask the very same question for the time period before 1980 and ask the same question for the period after 1980. We said, Chris, that's a great idea. Would you help us out? And he did. He led us through that analysis. And this is what we found, is that before 1980, we see that wolves have this very strong top-down influence. And then after 1980, we see that that strong top-down influence is just gone. It's basically replaced by climate. And here's the object lesson here, is that if you watched something for 20 years and then came to a conclusion like that, that's not very ambiguous, it's a pretty straightforward kind of interpretation you would give to that, you think you probably had it figured out until you watched for the next 20 years and found out that it was completely different. And so again, this is another thing that's kind of important about long-term research, is that you watch a place long enough basically to realize how wrong you had it. Okay, and so then time keeps going on a little bit, and kind of what's happening next. The next period of time, getting again a little bit more closer to the present day, and that means that our interpretations are a little bit more speculative and that sort of thing. What's key about this period here with the moose decline, well, that's the key part actually, is that moose went from about 1,100 to less than 500 over about an 8 or 9 year period. While that's going on, wolves are on the increase, notwithstanding that very last period where they kind of drop off. We were wondering, well, what's going on there? What we began doing in about the year 2000 is we began to document the effect of these ticks, or even just to document how their abundances change over time. So first of all, let me tell you a little bit about the ecology of the tick. It's Dermacenter albopictus is the Latin name for it. It's called it's called the moose tick, or sometimes called the winter tick. It's interested only in members of the deer family. It's active on moose in the winter time. So in the summertime, it exists only as eggs in the soil. Anyways, the main thing about the tick is that one heavily infested moose can have 70 or 80,000 ticks on it. And so this moose over here on the right moose have black skin. So what we're looking at is kind of a partially naked moose there. The shoulder is all bare, and those blonde areas, those are broken and damaged hairs. And this moose, it's just on the belly and on the nose where the hair is undamaged. The greatest amount of impact of these ticks on a moose occurs in late winter, early spring, and so it can cause the death of a moose if the infestation is severe enough. Well, basically, the first thing we had to do is figure out how in the world are you going to measure ticks. You can get graduate students to do a lot of things, but counting 70 or 80,000 ticks, there's limits. And so anyways, what we eventually began to do is just take lots and lots of photographs of moose in the springtime and then digitize the photographs and estimate the amount of hair loss that way. And not showing you all, oops, oh, I'm getting ahead of myself here. We'll go right here. Not showing you all of the details, but basically what's going on during this same period of time is that ticks were very, very high and also on the increase all throughout there. And so what we think is going on is that basically ticks are just weakening the moose, making them more vulnerable to predation. And that's, of course, a boon for the wolves. And the wolves do better and better and better until eventually there just aren't that many moose anymore. If you look across this time series, you'll notice that in the early part of the 21st century, that's the lowest we've ever seen moose on Isle Royale while we've been counting them. And so anyways, we have to kind of keep watching ticks and keep counting them and monitoring them and see if this continues to pan out, these kinds of patterns. But in any event, think about it for a minute. The prospect that a tick, this tiny little creature that's the size of your pinky fingernail, this one species could have such a profound impact on Isle Royale is really remarkable because, not only is it causing the moose to decline and then the wolves to perhaps increase, but it also, if moose are going from 1,100 to less than 500, there's a huge impact being had on the forest itself. And so, yeah, the prospect of such a tiny creature having such a big impact is kind of a big deal. Kind of coming up into more recent years, again, same kind of a thing. Interpreting exactly what's going on with wolves and moose is tough and takes a little bit more time for us to figure out what's going on. But the most interesting things that we've learned from Isle Royale are things that have always been going on, but we didn't discover them until just the last year or two. And so one of the things that we discovered has to do with some bone deformities in the wolves. This is a picture of a hip bone, pelvis for a wolf, and then that bone up at the top that's labeled S1, that's a sacrum. That bone is supposed to be symmetrical. What's on the left-hand side is supposed to be the same as what's on the right-hand side. And that red line kind of outlines the back edge of that bone, and it's obviously not symmetrical. This is a very common kind of deformity within inbred dogs. It's called the lumbar sacral transitional vertebrae, LSTV, well studied in dog populations. What we find is that, and again, this had always been going on, but we didn't realize it until in the last couple of years or so, is that 1 out of 3 wolves on Isle Royale has this problem, but in most wolf populations, it's only 1 in 100. And so these are some of the first signs of inbreeding depression for Isle Royale. But again, to emphasize, it had always been there for many, many decades. We just didn't know it. We basically didn't take notice of it until just a couple of years ago. And our notes are gone here, and so you must be up soon, or maybe, oh, I'll keep going then. I sometimes get accused of just talking and talking and talking, and then, so we have notes that remind me when it's time to stop. Anyways, the other thing that happened that's again something that we discovered in the last couple of years, but it's something that occurred some time ago, is this immigration event. And so what happened is, it's kind of highlighted this area in blue, is that in 1997 a wolf came from Canada and came to the Isle Royale population. We didn't discover it until the year 2010. The reason it took us that long to discover it is because what we do every winter for the last 13 winters or so is we collect as many scats as we possibly can. We collect them from kill sites where wolves have killed moose. And in these scats, you can get DNA, and from the DNA, you can get profiles to tell us, males from females, and brothers and sisters and so on. And so anyways, we stockpiled all of these scats because they're expensive to analyze, so we had to save them up until we had enough money to analyze them all. And it wasn't until the last couple of years that we did that. And the thing of it is that we knew the identity of this immigrant wolf. It's the wolf that's in the foreground here. It's this larger wolf in the front, this lighter in colored. We knew about his identity all along the time that he was alive, this period highlighted in blue. We knew about his identity because look at him. He doesn't look the same as these other wolves. Among wolves in general, it's not uncommon for them to turn light-colored when they get old, but on Isle Royale, that's never happened before until this guy came along. And you can also see he's a little bit bigger than the other wolves in that picture, and we could easily see that. That was how we told him apart from the others. We called him the old gray guy. He ended up leading one of the largest packs Isle Royale has ever seen, middle pack, and to make kind of a long story short, he was so successful that today, 56% of all of the genes in the Isle Royale population are attributed to him. He gave birth to 22 offspring. He has something like 37 grand offspring, and they're still being born. And so his immigration is, well, a couple of things, and we'll turn it over to Michael here. He'll tell you what's up now.
So the thing I didn't mention is the original population comes from a single male and a single female, and so you have this sort of inbreeding, and then you have this little rescue event that we find out about later in 1997. I think when I listen to John tell this story or Ralph tell this story, I mean, I'm sort of fascinated by it because people don't pay attention to stuff for very long, like minutes mostly, but to think of 53 years is actually kind of stunning. So it's admirable in a certain way, but I think there's a larger, synthetic lesson that's at work here, and that is really just that the truths or the assumptions that were held for a very long period of time in this study, that Isle Royale is an isolated population, that it's a highly inbred population, and as the story went before, is that there was no inbreeding depression. So it was an example of this population that we knew was inbred, but didn't seem to express that inbreeding inbreeding depression. That story, those truths, those assumptions turn out to not be true if you paid attention for a long enough period of time. It's not such an isolated population as we thought it was before. Yes, it's a highly inbred population. We didn't let go of that one. But it does now have inbreeding depression. But we only understand these things when we pay attention for a long period of time. And I think this is something we almost never see. This is why long-term ecological research is so unbelievably valuable. It makes us wonder immediately, what else do we assume? That if we paid attention long enough, we would find out wasn't true. I mean, what it does right away is immediately sort of sparks this, I think, what we just would call a sense of humility, or it ought to. It ought to make us humble. And I think that's one of the first places where the science of Isle Royale starts to touch on ethics. It starts to touch on what it seemed to be appropriate virtues that would correspond with this kind of work. Oops, I did that. Sorry. The other thing that I think is interesting when I think about this idea that, remember that the sort of map that showed that the first 25 years and the second 25 years look really different. You can keep dicing that up if you'd like to. It actually turns out that that every 5-year period looks different than every other 5-year period. And after 50 years, this is still the case, and we're not sure what the next 5-year period is going to look like. Every 25-year period differs fundamentally from the second 25-year period, or I guess every other. We have to wait for another 25 years to find out if that's true again. And as time goes on, I think what happens is we realize how poor our understanding really was. And I said that one time when I gave a talk on Isle Royale, and I was by myself, and I did it, and somebody said, well, maybe they're just not very good scientists, which I suppose could be a conclusion from that. But I don't think that's true. I think that, in fact, they're good scientists. That's why they reached this conclusion. So I think, to me, the first and hopefully obvious ethical implication from some of this work, the thing that we learn from long-term ecological research, is the importance of a few virtues, actually, not just, I don't think, humility, but also the virtue of persistence, or what we might even call attentiveness. And I think the people that we praise as conservation leaders are the people who manifest these virtues. They're persistent, they're attentive, and they're humble. They notice things that they might not otherwise notice. One might argue that, wow, those things, attentiveness, persistence, humility, lots of people would say that's what's really lacking in our relationship with nature. If we had more of that, I mean, that's in fact one way to describe what an appropriate relationship would look like in some people's eyes. So for some people, that'd be a lot of ethics done right in sort of one fell swoop. It raises certain, I think, interesting questions about also the purpose of science. So when we start to think about something like the Isle Royale study, well, what's the purpose of it? I mean, I talked about a purpose at the beginning of the talk to understand the relationship between wolves and moose. But if we want to start thinking about what the purpose of environmental science is with regard to conservation, how does the science that we do sort of funnel in and factor into conservation? We have two possibilities. I mean, one of the things that we could be trying to do with our science is we could be trying to predict the future. Now, it's hard to say that with a straight face after the story that John just told you. It's like, yeah, that's what we were doing on Isle Royale, we're trying to predict the future. That didn't work out so well. I mean, you wouldn't want to do that. I mean, I love to listen to John and Rolf when somebody says, what's going to happen next? Because they shuffle their feet and they look down. And I mean, why would you say such? I mean, nobody would answer that question anymore. But there's another option here that I think is important. If that's not what conservation or environmental science does, is predict the future, maybe what it does is it explains the past. And lots of the things that John was doing when he worked through this data set is he was, in hindsight, explaining what happened. There was no prediction of what was going to happen. It was an explanation. That raises a really interesting question. Is ecology, the science of ecology, is it more like physics? That it's really interested in predictable law-like regularities. That's what it's interested in. Why do I want to predict something? Probably so I can manage or control it. Is that what environmental science is about? And does that serve conservation? Or is it more like history, which is a different way to think about environmental science? Full of contingency, too full of contingency to be adequately predicted. But maybe explainable in hindsight, but still very cautiously explained, because we could have some of those explanations wrong as well. If environmental science is unable to provide adequate predictions of the future, what would be the value of explaining the past. I mean, historians will say, well, it has its value in and of itself. You explain the past so you don't repeat it or something like that. We have sort of bumper stickers and cliches to talk about the value of history. But maybe there's something else going on here as well. So one of the things that John and I spent a lot of time talking about and writing about is the purpose of science and how science serves or sometimes perhaps doesn't serve conservation. And really, in some ways, searching for a purpose for science. And one question we sort of spent a lot of time thinking about is, what if the primary purpose of ecology was to help understand our ethical relationship with nature? What if that's what ecology was actually about? Which seems strange, I admit. And the first thing we probably should do is sort of ask some simple questions like, what is ethics? And I want to sort of move into talk about ethics a little bit and where ecology might touch into ethics in a different way. The first thing we have a lot of hang-ups when we hear the word ethics. We think of people scolding one another. I think of my parents right away. It's not really like that. It's not telling other people what to do. It's not, that's parenting or preaching or something like that. There's lots of ways to define ethics. The way that we're thinking about ethics here, and the way I want to talk about it today, is that we can think of ethics more formally and more rigorously, and it'll look, I think, when we present it, it'll look like something you might be familiar with. You can think of ethics as the formal evaluation of a premise, of premises that end with a conclusion, and the conclusion is prescriptive. We ought to do something, we should do something because, and we provide reasons for why we should do something. So how does conservation science fit into ethics in this sense? Well, let's just take an example. I mean, I think one of the best ways to work with this is just to work with case studies and work with examples. So we're familiar with these kinds of things. People say things, we deal with wolf issues, so we're familiar with the things that people say about wolves. And so people say, I don't think this is actually a quote, but we could imagine it right from the newspaper or something, that we should hunt wolves because they prey on things they kill prey that we like to hunt. All by itself, that isn't an argument necessarily, but it implies one. And we can sort of develop it into an argument, and we can start to see where the science that we might do becomes really important in trying to figure out whether or not that's a good idea. So that's something that people do say or do believe, or it's something that maybe does influence people, but we can ask questions about whether or not it should. Is this a good argument? We can think about it that way. And we're going to have to rely on science to make sense out of that. So we can do this in a formal way. I mean, I'm an old philosophy professor, so you knew you were going to get some of this. You knew you were going to see P's and C's and stuff like that. It just happens. So we think about this utterance. We'll just call it an utterance that we hear. We should hunt wolves because they kill prey that we like to eat. If you take it all by itself, just sort of all by itself, there seems to be a premise that's implied. It's not explicitly stated, but it's implied. And the premise is that wolves reduce prey abundance. So we sort of clean it up, formalize it. And the argument in this utterance, all by itself, seems to jump from that premise, which is what we think of as an attempt to provide evidence for something, to a conclusion, a belief, an opinion, that wolves should be hunted. Now, I mean, I think we can look at this all by itself and think, I bet there's more, primarily because he left a whole bunch of white space in between. So it's very, very clever. If there's white space, there's more. So we think, I mean, it's pretty clear we need more to make this argument. And I'm not necessarily suggesting we have every bit that we need, and we can argue and sort of quibble about the wording of things, which is exactly what we should do. But I think we would need more premises to arrive from P1 to C. We'd have to say something about, we'd have to make a claim about hunting, reducing wolf abundance without threatening wolf viability. So we have this commitment to wolf viability, but we have this other kind of commitment. So if we want one thing, we have to sort of provide both of these things at the same time. We can't threaten wolf viability. We have to have a premise, I think, that looks something like this, that we have to say that reducing wolf abundance without compromising viability will increase prey abundance. Because it seems that what we're sort of interested in here is increasing or maintaining prey abundance as well. So we need some work on a premise like that. We have a should in our conclusion. We have an ought, a prescription. We need a normative premise. You don't get a prescription for action from a series of facts all by themselves. You have to have a normative premise. We usually try with all our might not to, but you have to. It's a principle of logic. It's just not my taste. It's actually something you have to have. And I think it would be something like this. I think there are two of them that kind of work together. The normative premise here would be P4. We shouldn't kill a living creature without an adequate reason. Notice it doesn't say we shouldn't kill living things. It just says we shouldn't do it without an adequate reason. And that increasing, I think we also have to have a premise that says something like increasing prey abundance is an adequate reason to kill wolves. So one of the places where ethics and science can sort of mesh together is in argument analysis. And we can actually do things like lay out the kinds of premises that we see here. These are not all, they don't even sound the same. They have different flavors to them. You can tell that by looking at them. And so we can look at the first three premises and we can say, well, those are premises that, those exist in the realm of science. You're not going to ask me if these things are true. Well, you could, but I would say, are these things true? What does the research say? What are you guys doing? So these premises exist in the realm of science. But science doesn't tell us these things, even though these things are necessary to reach this conclusion. These things exist, generally speaking, in the realm of ethics. I'm not saying that you ask an ethicist if these things are true. I'm saying they are things that we sort of come to as truths collectively. Ethicists might help sort of lead the discussion, but we don't discover the truth of these things necessarily. So in this argument, if it's laid out fully, like I said, it might not be, and we can sort of change it. We have three scientific premises and two ethical premises that allow us to arrive at this conclusion. So in other words, there's a lot of work to be done to make this argument whole. And we can evaluate these premises now. So the thing that I really like about this methodology is if we disagree on something, we now know why. And we now know where the conversation needs to take place. We're not sort of guessing anymore. The rules are established. We know where we can talk. Well, are these things true or not? I can't evaluate these, but so John filled in the red parts here. Do wolves reduce prey abundance? Yeah, sometimes, it seems like. Does hunting reduce wolf abundance without, or is it possible to have hunting that reduces wolf abundance without threatening wolf viability? John says, not obviously. I should have a little JS. A little picture of you, maybe, from John. The more controversial ones are the ones Mark says. Reducing wolf abundance without compromising wolf viability will increase prey abundance. Evidently, people aren't sure if that's the case. Can we evaluate normative premises? And this is where we get hung up with ethics sometimes. We think, well, geez, ethics. We can't evaluate ethical premises. Really? We can't? That we shouldn't kill a living creature without an adequate reason? I think we would say, yeah, that's probably a good rule. Or at least that seems to be a pretty good rule. We could probably talk about it, but it doesn't seem to be actually that controversial. Is increasing prey abundance an adequate reason to kill wolves? Well, there's conversation to be had there. It's not obvious that it is. There would definitely have to be a conversation. So whenever we use this example, I'm always happy to point out that the most firm premise we seem to have thus far is actually an ethical premise. And the rest of them are like, I don't know. So then this is very counterintuitive. This is not typically what we think. We think, oh, well, certainly we can agree on the science. It's the ethics that's going to really sort of bog us down. In many cases, that's probably true. In this case, it's probably not so true. So the thing that's interesting here is, the conclusion is only going to be as reliable as our strongest premise. And right now, as it stands, there's work to be done to get an argument like this to work. But to make it work, again, we have to have this kind of commingling of science and ethics. So what? John, so what?
So one of the things that Michael and I have been long interested in is to better understand the relationship between science and ethics. How do they interact with one another? And so what we're speaking about is the notion that this is ethics. This is what ethics is all about. In the way that we're presenting things, there's like kind of at least superficially, kind of an obvious role for science in helping us understand ethics. And it would come into the kind of, evaluating the truth of premises like this. And so I want to, let's work with that idea just a little bit. And in particular, let's think about this first one, P1. And again, what I want to do is I kind of want to give you a sense of what scientists do in terms of how we collect data and what we do with the data and how we analyze it and what we say it means and all that sort of a thing. And so one of the things, so this is kind of just going back to some basic ecology from Isle Royale. One of the things that we do is we measure these kill rates. I mentioned that a little bit in the beginning of the talk. Say a little bit more about how we do it. Every day for about 2 months during the winter, in January and February, we fly every day that the weather permits us. And in our flying, what we're doing is we're following these wolves around, following their tracks in the snow until we can see the wolves. And in following their tracks, we can see locations where it is that they've killed moose. And from this, we can basically get the kill rate, because the kill rate is just basically how many moose were killed divided by how many wolves made those kills over what length of period we were watching. And so one of the reasons that scientists are so interested in kill rates is because, and again, this is a little bit review from early part of the talk, but we'll take it just a little bit further. There are two ideas about how kill rate might vary. And one is that kill rate might increase asymptotically as prey abundance increases. This is one idea. It's been around for quite some time. A more recent idea, it only looks subtly different, but it ends up being pretty important, is that kill rate increases asymptotically as the ratio of prey to predator increases. Okay, well, it seems like such a subtle difference, and what would be the big deal there? Well, and this is not intuitive. This is not something you can just say, oh, yeah, I get it. But there's a lot of math that's involved. And anyways, after you go through all that math, here's the thing. If the world looks mostly like this, then what it means is that trophic cascades are most likely to happen. And then predators are going to end up being, because of that, really important components of shaping the way that ecosystems appear to us. However, if the world ends up looking like this, it turns out, if you do some math and some analysis, we would come to the conclusion that trophic cascades then would be very, very unlikely if the world is more like what we see on the right. And if trophic cascades are unlikely, this is one way of saying that predators aren't very important in shaping the nature of ecological communities. And so, okay, well, you can take these important ideas that have been around for quite some time, and you can compare them to the Isle Royale data, and you can look at this in a couple of ways. These are the same two graphs, the left and the right, as what we saw before. And if you're kind of fixated on that debate, you'd be impressed by the fact that this r squared is quite a bit more than this r squared over here on the left. If you're not so obsessed with the debate, you'd still look at this one and say, this one still isn't explaining a great deal of the variation that's going on, and would be interested in just that. In any event, the main point is that, okay, well, scientists can take data like that and lots of other kinds of data. People are studying, of course, predators all over the planet, many different species in many different ways. But this is meant to be just an illustration of, oh, okay, you can use scientific data like this to evaluate the truth of scientific premises. And so the question to ask is that all? Is that the end of the road? Is that all that science can do for helping us understand ethics? And well, let's just try something a little different. Okay, let's think of the very same data, exact same data, but let's start thinking about it in a different sort of a way. So that data first was collected in the year 1971. And so this shows, this is basically another way of speaking about the kill rate. It's the kilograms of food per wolf per day, and each one of these little boxes represents a different pack observed in a different year. So for the first couple of years, these 5 observations, and so this pack got a little bit more than 2 kilograms of food per wolf per day. For people who know wolves, Mark, this is after scavenging is taken out and all that kind of stuff. So, and anyways, these wolves here got about 3.5 kilograms per wolf per day. All right, well then, what do you do with that? Well, probably not much. You just, okay, there it is. But if you keep watching, then a few years later, you have some more observations. You're like, all right, that's fine. It's still hard to say much about it, I suppose. And now, okay, well, we've done it some more. It's been doing it now for almost 10 years. All right, that's fine. 15 years, okay. At this point, we have enough that we can put some reference points on here. This right here, in between 2 and 3 kilograms per wolf per day, that's the least amount of food that a wolf needs to just keep going, to stay alive. This is half of the minimum right here, and then this is twice the minimum, okay? And so we see already with this 15 years of data, there's several packs over here that have spent an entire winter getting less than half of what they need. And you say, well, how could they even possibly survive that? They don't. The mortality rates in these packs would easily be 50%. And then these are packs, of course, that, you know, if these packs are having it that bad, these packs, of course, well, they're delighting in livers and lungs and not necessarily having to work so hard to break open the bones and get the marrow and stuff like that. Well, anyways, it's not even over yet. You just keep watching. And so all the way up to the year 2000 now and all the way up to the year 2010. And so when you look at the data this way, and then we can have an inset over here, and when we realize that this histogram over in the top here is really just a very sterile way, very useful and illuminating, but very sterile way of looking at this, then you can begin to say, oh my goodness, what an incredible life it is that wolves lead. That from one year to the next, they could go from having really more food that they could possibly know what to do with, and then just maybe the very next year, not having hardly enough at all. In these severe years where life is tough, you know, 1 out of 2, 1 out of 3 wolves will be dying in a pack. Wolves are the same thing as dogs, really. And if you have a dog, you know that your dog knows who you are. Your dog knows when you've been gone from some time. And so when a wolf dies, they know that. And so imagine what it's like to be that kind of an animal that can just like, wow, we don't have enough food and we're dying left and right. And again, it's hard to wrap the mind around because in some very important ways, that's normal for them. This is what happens to them all the time. And so what I'm describing to you, of course, is empathy, which is just understanding another's perspective. And so empathy, it turns out, is an idea that's very, very thoroughly studied by psychologists. And so we know a few things about it. One is, how do you get empathy? Well, you get empathy by observing similarities and by becoming familiar. My training is in wildlife biology, so I read this later on in my career. When I read this, I was like, that's my job description. That's what I do. And then I asked myself, I said, what if the purpose of ecological knowledge was actually generating empathy? Not so much evaluating whether certain scientific premises are true or false for the purpose of an argument, but to do this. And of course you'd say, well, why would you want this to be the purpose, or what would be the value of thinking of it this way? The other thing that we know about empathy, and again, this comes from people who study empathy as a scientific phenomenon, is that for normal people anyways, if you become empathetic, that's basically the limiting factor for whether you care about something or not. If you are empathetic, you tend to care. If you tend not to care, it's usually because you're not being empathetic. And then we realize, wow, there's like a systematic way to become empathetic. And so here's the question. So we saw, one role that science might play in all of this. Well, if we think of the very same data, that's the remarkable thing. That's the exact same data as this stuff here. And if we realize, wow, if we present it in this way, and if that can lead to empathy, and if that could lead to caring, well, might that not make us think differently about this premise, which is actually an ethical premise? Now, some people might say, whoa, that's going way too far. Science really has no business doing that. That's just a plain old weird perversion of what the purpose of science is. Well, let's think about that for a minute. Durward Allen, he's the fellow who started this project in 1958. And when he started it, he had an explicit purpose, and his purpose was to Is this mine or yours?
It's mine, but you're doing really well.
I don't think I saw the post-it.
Dude, you just ignore the post-its. I'm sure you just see these post-its are like this big with M and like stars on it. I'm going to put a buzzer on his hands. So one of the ways to think about empathy is to think about, well, is this something that, you know, some freaky John and Rolf came up with later on when they started hanging out with freaky me? It turns out not so much. It turns out that even back in the original study, Durward Allen was really interested in this. His purpose is to understand wolf-moose dynamics, but you can say, well, why? Why did he want to understand wolf-moose dynamics? Think about this point in time in history. This is not the best time in this country for wolves when Durward Allen starts studying wolves. And one of the things he's very explicit about is he's interested in the assumptions we make about the nature of wolves that then feed into our prescriptions for action with regard to what we do with wolves. So he very intentionally is interested in testing and, I think, dispelling. In some of his writings you can see he's very interested in dispelling the myths that cause us to hate wolves, the assumptions that we make about the nature of these animals, which then sort of are things that interfere with our sense of empathy. So again, here's another place where scientific knowledge and ethical attitudes interact in a different way than they do perhaps with the virtues of humility and attentiveness or with formal argument analysis, this kind of creation of empathy which we think of as a moral sentiment. The other thing we know is that the people that we admire in conservation, the Aldo Leopolds and the Rachel Carsons, are also interested in this. This is one of the things, and I'll mention this in a minute, that Aldo Leopold is very fond of, as this notion of an empathetic relationship. Now the question we might have is, well, how far can it go? Right? So we have this capacity to be empathetic, right? It can be conditioned, it can be changed. We can learn things about the world and become more empathetic, or we can make assumptions and become less empathetic. But how far can you actually push empathy? And that's a great question. I mean, it's fun to speculate about. Can you actually have empathy for all kinds of things? Individual living things, non-living things, systems, biotic communities, watersheds? Can you be empathetic? Can you express empathy for Isle Royale itself? How far can this actually go? I think I would suggest that we're actually quite familiar with this, and we're actually quite familiar with it being sort of pushed very far. One of the first things I think about when I think about empathy is I think about the giving tree. You wouldn't understand the giving tree. It wouldn't be such a moving story if we didn't understand empathy. Admittedly, it's a children's story, and it's fictional. But we understand empathy. We understand the idea that the child and the tree are expressing empathy back and forth. So we might not like that because it's a fictional account, but I think there are equally non-fictional accounts that do much the same thing. I think about what Aldo Leopold is talking about in his very famous essay, Thinking Like a Mountain. He's a scientist, he's an ethicist, he's entwining these two disciplines. This is probably the single most important, popular episode in the history of conservation. Leopold shooting the wolf, watching the fierce green fire dying in the wolf's eyes, and his speculations are empathetic speculations. He's wondering, I mean, what we tend to focus on is he's wondering what it's like to be a mountain, to think like a mountain. So he's empathizing with this sort of mountain system, with something we might wrestle with. Can you empathize with a system like a mountain? But at the same time, he's also empathizing with the wolf that he's encountering. So in the real world, a story that we prize, that we think is really valuable, we've seen famous ecologists read this story and start to weep, actually. I saw the same famous ecologist do it twice, which made me a little suspicious. It was like that was a shtick or something. But it gets us, and there's a reason why we think of this as a powerful story. So this sort of attachment and the power of empathy, I think, is within conservation. It's probably very latent within conservation, but it's certainly there. So this one has a big J on it, and I'll just hand right off.
So anyways, as we think about what science and ethics can do when we think about them together, empathy is only one element of it all. And to give another example of something different, I want to think about some more data that comes from Isle Royale. So this graph shows that as the pack size for wolves on Isle Royale increases, then the amount of food that each wolf on average tends to decrease. That's what this decreasing red line means. This kind of pattern has been a real hard thing for many ecologists to figure out. It shows up not only in wolves, but it also shows up similar patterns in lions, African wild dogs, other species that live in groups, other predators that live in groups. The reason that it's perplexing is this, basically. If you're 15 wolves, if you're a pack of 15 wolves and none of you are getting very much, why wouldn't you just break up into 3 smaller groups? Should be each one of you do better off. And so this has been a real mystery for why is it that animals like wolves, why do they live in groups? Well, anyways, we got to be thinking from the observations that we make, maybe it has something to do with scavengers. On Isle Royale, the most important scavenger would be ravens. And you wouldn't think that, well, what could ravens do? Well, one raven can take up to like 4 pounds of food a day, and there can be 20 ravens on a kill easily. Ravens by themselves could eat most of a moose carcass. And so what we began to wonder is that, well, what if by living in a big pack, all right, sure enough, you have to share with your brothers and sisters and parents and offspring and all that. But because in a big pack you would eat that carcass so quickly, you would lose very little to scavengers. Compare that to, say, just a pack of 2 or 3 wolves. It's going to take them so long to eat the carcass that they lose so much to ravens. Well, anyways, if you can kind of formulate that very carefully and take a number of observations about what happens to different size packs and how much ravens are taking and stuff like that. And anyways, if you account for the effects of scavenging, then it turns out this is actually what wolves living in different group sizes get. And what you see now is, oh, it's the very smallest pack sizes that do the worst, and these larger pack sizes do better. Now, when we published this paper a few years back now, it received quite a bit of press attention. But think about why for a minute. This is of absolutely no value for managing anything. What would you do with that information? There isn't anything. But the reason that it got so much attention, I think, is because is basically because it's this remarkable connection. In this case, this kind of unexpected connection between ravens and wolves to explain this phenomenon, the living in groups. And I think, anyways, that humans just have this appreciation, this innate appreciation for these connections that surprise us, and these connections that basically make us say, wow, that's really remarkable. It's more than just connections. The other thing that's important besides empathy and connections, we got a sense of it when we went through this time series, is that at least for Isle Royale, we can tell the story of wolves and moose as their lives go from one day to the next, from one season to the next, from year to year, and even from wolf generation to wolf generation. It's basically a narrative for people who are old enough, like Roots or Centennial or these kind of mini-series types of things. And so narratives, that's how human beings relate to the world. That's how we understand the world. And so we can think of using ecology as a way of kind of telling a story about what in this case the lives of animals are all about. And now I want to shift just a little bit. The Wolf Moose Project has a pretty well developed and outreach program. We have dozens of associates that work with our project, and we give many dozens of talks every year, speaking to thousands of people every year. We have volunteers that come out and help us do work in the field. We have print media, we have web-based media, quite a bit of outreach. And here's the thing is that these themes, the ones that we've already seen, empathy, connections, narrative, in addition to 2 others, the complex nature of ecosystems and their contingent nature, how it is that what happens next just depends on things like, oh, this disease came and nobody could have expected that. In any event, these themes, they really arise rather naturally and organically. You don't have to hardly work at all for that story to kind of emerge. And I think what happens is that it all leads to basically a sense of place, in this case a sense of place about Isle Royale. But if you think of doing, I see many students here that hopefully will go on and either do some kind of management or science as they go on in their careers. I mean, you'll be doing that work in some place, and if you can think of the purpose of your work as trying to develop a sense of place, not only for you, but for the people who you share your research with, wouldn't that be quite an interesting way to think of the purpose of your work? The purpose of doing science. And then, you know, to kind of basically wrap it all up, we can ask ourselves, in the big picture, you know, what are the limits to conservation? What prevents us from in the cases where we fail to do so, what prevents us from conserving things in the ways that we think that we should? There's basically two possibilities. One is that we're limited by knowledge. We don't know how to restore this thing or how to prevent it from being damaged. But the other possibility is that we just have a poor attitude in the first place. We already know what we need to do. We're just not interested to do it. And so it just begs the question, it just begs taking seriously this question. You know, what if the primary purpose of ecology was not so much to give us more knowledge that we might not be putting to use anyways, but was actually there just to change our attitudes in the first place? And so anyways, that's, I think, where we'll leave it, and we'd be happy to take any questions. If they're easy questions, you could ask me. If they're hard ones, you can ask him. Yes?
What do you feel is the role of scientists like yourself who do studies like this in communicating those connections to the public who might not necessarily have the access to that information or the ability to interpret and ability?
Oh, yeah, so I'll repeat the question. You let me know if I get it good enough. The question is basically about what is the role of scientists in communicating some of these ideas, especially to a wider audience who may not have access to all that information. Is that, yeah? I think there's some complexities here. You know, different people have different skills, first of all, and some people are more skilled at communicating than other folks. And so notwithstanding that sort of a thing, yeah, I think every scientist has a great responsibility to communicate. We have responsibilities we accept already to communicating with other scientists, right? And as we're learning that ability to communicate, it's hard. It's hard to make a scientific poster. It's hard to make a slideshow, but we work at it really, really hard. And we're bright people if we're doing this kind of work. And so I think the main thing is that if we just realize that this is an important audience type, the general public, and this message of basically caring and showing people how and why to care, that's a worthwhile message, I think we'd apply ourselves with the same diligence that we do for writing scientific papers and stuff like that.
With the wolf, I don't know, with the wolf debate where you have your Montana, our ranching, our hunting, how would you bridge the gap to our Royale, which is one of the least visited national parks, and I mean such an isolated landscape in which we see this interaction play? How would you kind of bridge the gap between this information and trying to apply it to a place like Montana?
Had any wolf issues in Montana? So I don't know how to answer. Caught me by surprise. I mean, you'd have to be careful, right? I mean, you know, we weren't probably careful when we said, oh, Isle Royale stands as an example of a population that's small, but not inbred, and is just fine. And so people love to use Isle Royale as an example of that. Now that we found out that they're not, that they do suffer, some of the same people like to say, well, you can't extrapolate the example outward, so people shift. So I mean, the first thing is one has to be cautious, but I guess it depends. For me, it would depend on the argument. I showed you, one argument, and I think there's a whole suite of arguments. So if you're interested in hunting or not hunting wolves, those are all premised on certain positions, certain arguments, which you could lay out formally, just like I did there, every single one of them. And some of the premises are going to be scientific premises, and some of those scientific claims, the Isle Royale Wolf Moose study is probably going to have something to say about them. It's not going to have something to say about all of them, I don't think. And again, we have to be careful about extrapolating too much. But some of those premises are they're going to make claims about, well, you know what the claims are. Wolves are gratuitous killers, right? Well, you saw the kill rates. I mean, these guys down here were doing real well, but not so much these guys. So if it was really true that wolves were gratuitous killers, that chart would look really different. So Isle Royale would present challenges to certain kinds of claims like that. But again, not all of the claims, just some of them.
You don't want to correct that?
Oh,
I mean, add to?
Yeah, I could say some more things, more on the sciencey side of things. One of the things about making inferences is that, remember the thing about ecology is that we're struck by how this ecosystem seems to be so different from that ecosystem, seems to be so different from this other ecosystem. And so I know, just because I work with Isle Royale all the time, people are constantly reminding us, that's only a single predator, single prey. Most places aren't like that. That's an island. Most places aren't like that. I'm like, yeah, but the place you're studying ain't like most places either. The main difference is that nobody ever lets me forget that, because they remind me all the time. And so every scientist, when you're studying an ecological system, you always have to know what conclusions are specific to that place and what conclusions can be inferred other places. And that's the short answer is it's just tough to make those judgments, but they can be made, and we make them regularly and that sort of thing. I don't mean we on Isle Royale, but scientists do. So that's just a sciencey take on the same question. You want to call on the question?
Mike, I think it was you who has said that you think that ethics is latent in conservation science. Where do you see, or both of you, where do you see the future of the North American wildlife conservation model in terms of including ethics?
We just published an article
On that. You know, it's funny because I have to confess, whenever I hear North American model of wildlife conservation, even though I've spent so much time thinking about it and published it, I'm still not quite sure what it is. I really don't. I really don't know what it is that people are pointing to. It's actually unclear to me what role, it's clear to me that ethics plays a role in it, but it's unclear to me what kind of ethic it's premised on. So now I'm talking about it like I do know what it is. I realize it's hard, it's challenging for me. So it's not clear to me that the North American model as it's articulated, is it primarily, is it an anthropocentric position? Is it about sort of human welfare? Or, well, okay, so then then that answers your question. But I think for some people, when they see it, they want to say, no, it's more than that. Or if it can't be more than that, they want to say, we're done with that. So I actually think, I think of conservation at this moment in time as absolutely up for grabs, because it's not clear to me what basic ethical assumptions it's premised on. Is it only anthropocentric and maybe glorified anthropocentric, it's smart anthropocentrism, or is it something that's non-anthropocentric? And I don't think we have an answer for that. I don't think we know what it is. I think that's one of the great, if not the great tension within conservation right now.
Yeah. I guess I would maybe just add, in addition to that too, I think the North American model is, it's such a narrow slice, such a narrow view of our relationship with nature, even just in North America. To propose that hunting is the centerpiece of conservation in North America, how do you explain Rachel Carson? How do you explain the Endangered Species Act? How do you explain the Clean Air and Water Acts? Those are all momentous events in conservation that have nothing to do with hunting. And so I think if we want to have an explanation and understanding of the role of hunting in conservation, that's great. Let's sort that out and figure it out. But to propose that hunting is somehow like the totality of conservation, that doesn't make any sense.
Thank you.
I'm a wildlife historian, so I like the narrative idea that you raised here. But I was curious because you said 1900 moose came to the island. Were they introduced?
It's not known for sure, but they probably swam. Moose, there's about 15 to 20 miles of water that they would have to swim, and moose, Lake Superior is very cold. But moose are very big, and so they can survive the cold waters. They have a very small brain, so they don't much think about what would prevent me from just getting in the water and going. And so they probably swam. We know that in the Pacific Northwest and also in Sweden, in Norway, where there's lots of cold water and islands, moose are frequently found swimming 5-10 miles out from land, and so they probably swam.
It seems to filter a lot of animals because there are other animals that make it to Isle Royale, but they're dead when they show up.
Yeah.
So doesn't Rolf talk about a goat that one time?
Yeah, and we had a goat that came washed. White-tailed deer wash up dead on the island every 2 or 3 years or something like that. They can't survive the cold water. But do you have a follow-up to that thought?
No,
Okay,
because
yeah.
I know that I work with animal histories out of Yellowstone, and they exported animals like crazy around that period.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if people had taken
There are thoughts to that effect, and so the thing that's challenging about it is that there are some, so to speak, old timers that remember when they were young, their dad talking about some, Finlander brought a moose over, but those have been really hard to find any credibility to in terms of newspaper stories from the turn of the century that would suggest that or anything. So it's people do speak that way, but it's hard to see that it might be true.
I mean, we do know that people at that time thought all kinds of things like that were good ideas.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't be out of the ordinary in a way.
It's difficult for numbers in Yellowstone, at least for moose, but elk at 1900 went all over the country. So that's why I just was wondering.
And at one point, wolves were taken off the island to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan.
Yeah, to reintroduce wolves into Michigan or moose.
So are the wolves going to be inbred? The moose going to be inbred because of the small parent population?
Yeah, so we know a whole lot less about moose population genetics on Isle Royale compared to wolves. So the short answer is we don't know. But one of the things that would have been important is that while there would have been a bottleneck, that bottleneck would not have lasted for very long because it would have increased relatively rapidly. And then on average, there's been about 1,000 moose on Isle Royale. And so if there are inbreeding problems, it just takes a longer time to show up and all that sort of thing. So there could be stuff, but we haven't looked into it so much.
With the bone deformities found in wolves, do you think that would have had a long-term effect on the moose population because of limited ability to hunt?
Oh, it's a great question, and it's hard to know. So the fitness of that wolf population, you would sure think it would have something to do with their predator-prey relationships, but as, kind of sadly, that's about as much as we know. To be able to form the question is about it. So, yeah.
Yes, we can ask the question.
You want to ask it?
Up there.
Have you noticed any major trophic cascade effects on forage when in this ecosystem?
Yeah. So we have, and so the main piece of evidence has to do with, remember when the wolves crashed? Okay, and then they stayed low for a long time. And then while that was going on, the moose went up and up and up. One of the things that we know that was going on at the very same time is that tree rings, which is one of the major ways that we can kind of document vegetation changes on Isle Royale, tree rings for balsam fir, which is a tree species that moose like to eat in the wintertime, those tree rings really started to grow very, very slow when that moose population took off. And so that's kind of the best evidence that we have of one of these kind of classic trophic cascades whereby the wolves went down, moose went up, and then the vegetation went down. So, and if you think about that really carefully, of course, that says strong top-down system, and then you saw some of those regression analysis results that kind of showed the opposite thing. The inconsistency there, I think, basically speaks to this thing that when we say, is this system top-down or bottom-up? That's like a half a dozen different questions, but we use the same English words to represent all those different questions, and then we do different analysis. I think they're answers to different questions. That's why we get different answers. Yeah.
When you analyzed the argument about should we hunt wolves, you sort of included in the three scientific premises some inherent ethics by including the phrase without threat to viability of the wolf population. Yeah. I think traditionally that argument has not included that phrase. We don't care about the viability, we only care about the viability.
I was being nice.
Right, well, that's my question. Is I'm wondering, so I think if you eliminated that phrase, the science would validate those premises a lot more easily. How do you think that would look differently if that phrase wasn't there, or do you think you put that phrase in because science did what you concluded its job was and taught you to have empathy?
I think that phrase is there because it's actually a legal obligation.
Yeah.
We're obligated to not.
Are you coming to the workshop this weekend? Yeah.
Oh, that's right. That could have been a teaser, couldn't it, for the workshop?
But you can't just say it's a legal obligation because the law came from society informed by ethics.
Good. So it is an ethical problem.
Yeah. I think one of the things that it's focusing on that is very sharp, astute observation. What it shows is that many propositions are both scientific and ethical all at the same time, and you nailed it right on the head. Those are even harder to deal with.
Yeah.
But recognizing them is the first challenge.
Yeah. And so certain premises are going to have words like Well, anytime you see the word significant, that's a red flag. You should, there's got to be something normative in there. So there are lots of words like that that are built into these premises that are value laden, absolutely. Somebody up there had there.
What is the source of your funding for the Royale?
Oh, it's, yeah. National Science Foundation pays for a large portion of it. The National Park Service pays for a smaller portion of it, and then increasingly private donations. Private donations probably outstrip the Park Service at this point for funding the work. Yeah.
Is there any talk at all of reintroducing wolves or moose on the islands with vulnerable populations?
Yeah. So what we didn't finish, what we discovered just this last year is that wolves are not at an all-time low, which was 12, but they're at 15.
Yeah.
And when winter study ended this year, we had at least a day, I was on the island at that time, where we held our breaths because we were worried that there was 15 wolves but no females, which even I know. It took me about an hour. They were all nervous. I'm like, what are you nervous about? And they told me, and I'm like, and then about an hour later, I'm like, oh my God, that's bad. That's bad, right? But so it turns out not to be the case, but there's no more than 2 females, no more than 2 females. And so it does definitely raise a question. The bone deformity raised a question as well, and that is a question about genetic rescue. The question now is, I mean, there's a number of options. One option is genetic rescue of the population now, essentially introducing new genetic material. Another option is wait and see what happens, but be ready with a plan if they disappear. And one of those plans could be introduce a new population, or do nothing. And there are a whole suite of really important values that are battling it out in a debate like that. None of them are kind of obviously superior to any other, and each of those values you seem to be able to interpret in a variety of ways. So this is a very serious kind of ethical dilemma that we are sort of confronted with at the moment. And we have a paper coming out in April where we sort of try to articulate a position wrestling with all of those values.
Yeah. Maybe we should stop?
Yeah.
Yeah. Just because. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Maybe, we'll hang around if people have more questions, but maybe we'll stop for here. And so thanks so much for
everyone.
all your time.